Kalen's boot connected with the magnetic detonator, sending the device skittering across the Zenith Spire's polished obsidian floor. The Saurian Warchief roared, a sound like grinding tectonic plates, as the lead terrorist's thumb hovered over empty air. Silence gripped the negotiation chamber. 1 second. 2. He didn't look at the bomb. He looked at Archduchess Alara. The silence of the spire is never truly empty. If you want to hear the secrets buried in the pulse cores of the galaxy, subscribe to our logs. Now, let's see how a simple technician ended up in the crosshairs of a revolution. A crown demands respect, technician, Archduchess Alara had whispered 7 days earlier. At the time, Kalen Vance was merely elbow-deep in the flickering circuitry of a hospitality terminal, his focus entirely on a faulty Ethelgardian pulse core rather than royal protocol. The Zenith Spire was a miracle of symmetry, a needle of white alloy piercing the atmosphere of a gas giant. But to Kalen, it was just another machine with bad wiring. He wiped his hands on a grease-stained oil rag, the fabric stiff with carbon and industrial lubricant. Around him, the delegates of a dozen systems moved with the calculated grace of apex predators pretending to be diplomats. Archduchess Alara watched him from the balcony, her eyes tracking the rhythmic motion of his work. She was Ethelgardian, her skin shimmering with a faint bioluminescent pulse that matched the station's heartbeat. To her, Kalen was a curiosity, a soft-bodied death-worlder who seemed more interested in subspatial harmonics than the stagnant trade negotiations currently threatening to dismantle 3 centuries of peace. He wondered if she knew the core was venting plasma in a way that, no, that wasn't his job to explain. A half-eaten nutrient bar, wrapped in crinkled foil, sat on the edge of his toolkit. It smelled vaguely of artificial cinnamon and stale air. The incident started with a Vorn warrior. He was a massive creature, his chitinous armor scarred from 100 skirmishes, and he had decided that a smaller delegate from the Saurian systems was standing too close to the ceremonial fountain. The Vorn's hand, a cluster of serrated pincers, tightened around the smaller alien's throat. Ursax was a creature designed for the high-gravity trenches of Vorn 4. When he seized the Saurian, the Ethelgardian peacekeepers hesitated. Their protocols didn't account for a Vorn in a blood frenzy. Kalen didn't drop his wrench. He didn't even stand up. He just looked at the Vorn and spoke. The words were low, guttural, and carried a rhythmic cadence that made the Saurian delegate's throat sac flutter in a frantic, rhythmic panic. It was a restricted warrior dialect, a language of honor and blood that no Terran was supposed to know. The Vorn froze, its pincers clicking in a sudden, frantic uncertainty. How could a scavenger from Earth speak the tongue of the Vorn High Guard? Restraint, Kalen said in English, his voice flat. It's a protocol you might want to learn before you bleed on the Archduchess's carpet. Kalen went back to his wrench. Then the siren started. It wasn't the terrorists yet, but a secondary hull breach during a standard pressure drill. While the nobles panicked, scurrying for the escape pods in a flurry of silk and scales, Kalen was already moving. He didn't run, he navigated. He barked at a group of disoriented Saurian guards, and they followed him because he sounded like he owned the oxygen. They reached the maintenance ducts where the smoke was thickest. Alara was there, trapped behind a thermal partition that was buckling under the pressure. Kalen shoved a Saurian guard aside, wedging his shoulder against a falling structural beam to keep the path clear. He felt the rib snap. It was a dull, wet thud inside his chest, followed immediately by a white-hot flare of agony. He didn't make a sound. Instead, he reached into the smoke, his fingers finding Alara's hand. He hauled her through the gap, just as the beam gave way. They tumbled into a secondary junction, the air thick with soot and the copper tang of his own blood. He leaned against the bulkhead, his face a mask of sweat and grime, and pulled the oil rag from his pocket to press against his side. If the Archduchess saw the way his blood was the same color as the Vorn's. No, focus on the seal. Have you ever seen a man hold back a storm with just a few words? What would you do if you realized the person fixing your lights was the most dangerous soul in the room? The smoke from the maintenance duct was still stinging Kalen's eyes when the shattered chain struck. They didn't come with a roar. They came with a precision that suggested they had been watching the security rotations for months. Within seconds, the main negotiation chamber was a cage. Archduchess Alara was forced onto her knees beside the Saurian Warchief, while a lead insurgent with a facial scar that looked like a jagged lightning bolt brandished a high-yield magnetic detonator. Kalen watched from the shadows of the ventilation grate. He noticed a loose button hanging by a single thread on his tactical vest, swaying slightly with every shallow, pained breath he took. If the detonator was a high-frequency pulse unit, the resulting explosion would. He didn't finish the thought. There was no time for math. The insurgent shouted a demand in Ethelgardian, but Kalen wasn't listening to the words. He was looking at the way the Warchief's eyes darted toward the ceiling. He used a series of sharp, clicked consonants to speak directly into the Warchief's mind using a subvocal frequency that bypassed the room's dampeners. It was the ancient Saurian ceremonial logic, a philosophical trap designed to force an apex predator into a state of tactical subservience through the recognition of a superior sovereign. Alara felt the shift in the air. She reached out with her mind, finding Kalen in the dark, her bioluminescence dimming to a steady, focused amber. She became his eyes. Between the Archduchess's telepathic guidance and his own hardwired reflexes, Kalen moved through the smoke like a scalpel, neutralizing the first three insurgents with an efficiency that wasn't just practiced but seemed almost biological in its lack of hesitation or wasted motion. He was Ghosts. He was a Deathworlder who had stopped pretending to be a technician. He dropped from the rafters. The air in the chamber curdled into a static charge that made Kalen's hair stand on end. Every delegate was frozen, their collective breath caught in the throat of the galaxy as the Terran landed in a crouch. The lead terrorist's thumb twitched, a desperate reflex born of sudden, bone-deep terror. Kalen's boot connected with the magnetic detonator, sending the device skittering across the Zenith Spire's polished obsidian floor. The device hit the far wall with a heavy clatter, its armed light pulsing a rhythmic, angry red. Kalen didn't pause. He stepped into the terrorist's guard, his hands moving with a restraint that was more terrifying than a closed fist. He didn't kill the man. He dismantled his ability to fight in 3 precise strikes. The Warchief stood slowly, his massive frame trembling, not with rage, but with a realization that made his scales go cold. He looked at Kalen, then at the detonator, then back at the man who had spoken the forbidden dialect of his ancestors. Silence followed. For months later, the Zenith Spire was quiet. The trade agreements had been signed, but the atmosphere had changed. The Ethelgardian pulse cores were humming perfectly, yet the delegates walked the halls with a new, frantic habit of checking over their shoulders. On a high shelf in the Archduchess's private study sat a small, square frame. Inside, pressed behind glass, was a grease-stained oil rag. It was no longer a tool of a scavenger, but a reminder of the predator who had walked among them, fixed their machines, and chosen not to burn their world down. If you want to see what happens when the bridge builder finally stops building, we will be here tomorrow. We'll be waiting.